In this section, we think about the ongoing working with your student. So we're going to look a little bit at the ways in which their ability and continued ability to focus on their learning, supported by you, is related to things that happen to them in their lives, how much you feel you need to be involved in supporting the learning, and also some of the personal crises that might affect the learning. And we're thinking also about issues to do with students who don't continue and why that might happen. So some of the breakdowns that take place in supervision, and therefore how we might forewarn ourselves about these and stop them happening when they shouldn't happen. Some research that I and others carried out in about 2012, finished in 2012, called Doctoral Learning Journeys, looked at revealed the interaction between different spheres of students' study lives, so that we found that their intellectual development, their ability to engage with the complexities of the research and the project and thinking in a complex, creative, conceptual fashion about their ongoing research was affected by, positively or negatively, the experiences they were having as human beings, which isn't a surprise really. But sometimes I think if we've been focused on the research project, we might forget there's a human being there having all sorts of experiences and life crises. For international students, some of those are about settling in and understanding the ways in which a different culture behaves and the things you can say to each other and how learning takes place. And even such things as having enough money to eat and to stay somewhere. So students might be beleaguered by those sorts of quite basic experiences just about living, ordinary living, and they might not talk to you about those things. They also, along their learning journeys, might come across problems to do perhaps with their domestic situations, with their aging parents, or if they're parents themselves, with their children, with all sorts of things to do with illness, health, moving jobs if they're mid-career professionals. So if you think about an entire sphere of personal and emotional experiences to do with health and well-being and finance and emotions, then all of that, which they might not talk to you about, is affecting their learning. So one of the questions that I think we need to ask is, how much do we have to be involved in this? If you feel uncomfortable with playing a role which looks perhaps a bit like a counsellor, then I think you need to be reassured that you're not expected to be a counsellor, although you might well be the first person that they discuss some of these issues and problems with, because you're the person perhaps that they talk to most, or they feel they need to inform about some of these issues. So I think where the issues are quite complex, it's safer for the working relationship if you refer them on to the university's counselling service or other people like that in the university who will be able to talk to them about personal, emotional, welfare, finance, kinds of concerns, so that you are showing that you're concerned, but you're also showing that you're maintaining a professional relationship. For some students for whom emotional, personal, domestic, medical, etc. crises take place during the course of this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 year PhD or maybe a 2-year master's, the one thing that keeps them going is knowing that they're operating intellectually, and they welcome the fact that you continue the professional relationship that gives them responses to, feedback to, and support for their intellectual work. So it isn't always the case that they need to stop or take time off. And it would not be positive if you spent your entire supervisory contact with them, supporting them in terms of their personal issues. But I think we do need to take note of those, because sometimes they hold students up. And nobody's a machine in this interaction, even if we all want to get the research done. There's human beings on either side. So there's the intellectual linked with the personal and emotional. And there's another link there, and that's to do with the way in which the student develops an identity, an academic identity, during the course of their research projects. They're becoming researchers, they're becoming writers, some of them might become academics, And I think that that can be enabled not just by us engaging in an equal learning dialogue with them so that we're respecting the ideas and the issues that they come up with, but also for us putting them in touch with other academics and other academic students. This returns as an issue as we get towards the end of the different sections on the website, because the way in which we help establish students in a network, a communication with others who are working in their field locally and internationally, is something that they take away at the end of the project, at the end of the whole research process. So it's probably important quite early on to see whether there's an academic community that they can join. Some of this now will be on the internet. They might talk to somebody in Italy or somebody in Thailand who's working on similar projects. You might be able to put them in touch with other professors who will talk to them on the email and send them things to read, though we don't want to overstretch that because some students are very needy and will ask a lot of questions of people that we don't know very well. But we're putting them into contact with a local community where they can share ideas, share perhaps drafts of their writing, present to each other, or whether that's formal or informal, whether you've got seminars where they are expected to present to each other, or whether you just suggest that they share some of their writing, some of their ideas with others. It's important for us to put them in touch with communities so that they can develop their academic identities as researchers and writers. The other area that we found, the other dimension that interlocked with all this, was for some students they're undertaking their research alongside or in relation to their professional practice. So they're also juggling perhaps work demands, and they're also thinking, how does this fit into the job I'm doing, and how is my researching here being perceived, if I'm a part-time student, back in my job? So it's important, I think, to recognise and reward and also challenge many of the issues that they come in perhaps from their professional practice, if that's the kind of research they're doing. So someone who is working in a business organisation, or maybe they're an engineer or they're a practising teacher, they're undertaking research into that professional practice is a challenge, and I think we add to that challenge by getting them to think about the theory behind the decisions they're making and about the assumption they've made. Because being a researcher on your professional practice means you are reading about it, asking questions about it, and theorising. And that's quite uncomfortable sometimes when you feel already that you are quite a long way on in your career, your professional practice. So exploring your practice through using research is both challenging and also enormously enabling and developing for students. And we're part of that dialogue. We're part of asking the questions, giving them the reading, suggesting other readings, suggesting they talk to other people, and then responding to what they write. If they're working with their own professional practice, some students have a tendency to either celebrate it uncritically or to write descriptively and informatively about it. The shape of, for instance, a business report, which business students might be used to producing, is not the same shape as a master's or a PhD. We don't end up usually with straightforward recommendations, having given a lot of information. We're constantly asking questions, theorising them and exploring them, and probably not really coming to final conclusions that solve all the problems. So they might need to learn to write differently. The next dimension is the institutional dimension, and I've spoken in the last section about personal learning and institutional. But I think it's important that we are both the resource for the regulations and the rules, so we know how long a piece of work should be, what it should look like, what dates things should be handed in on, but also that we hand a lot of that responsibility over to the students, because nowadays most of those regulations and rules are actually on a website and they need to find out for themselves. So while we're both working in relation and in touch with these, the students should be up to date with rule changes, and so referring them to the website. So really, this research learning journey that they're on, it has many dimensions which interlock. Sometimes things go wrong, and there has been quite a lot of research recently about breakdowns in the relationships. At that point, there's obviously several reasons why you might not get on with your student. It might be that their research project is not progressing. So that's a point at which to start investigating why that's so, whether it's too complex, too conceptual, whether they haven't made what we talk of as a conceptual learning leap, crossing a conceptual threshold, and whether they need more reading or more exposure to discussions with others, questioning and nudging from us in order to make those sorts of leaps, or whether they actually haven't been putting enough work in. So sometimes students get stuck, but it's for many reasons, and they're not always laziness, or sometimes it's intellectual stuckness. And I think our role is to help them clarify their thinking and work out how they're going to be working their way through these problems. But some of them remain stuck. Sometimes it's an emotional and personal crisis that makes them stuck, and sometimes they run out of time, for instance. There are many instances, surprisingly many instances, where supervisor-student relations break down, and some students leave at that point. It's important to know what the rules and regulations are to support you and the student. And there are instances where the institutional norms of actually going through a progress report, actually getting other people to read their work as a kind of formal expectation, can enable new thoughts to come to the student about what they need to do next, or can clarify your sense that really they'd probably be better off at the moment taking a year out, stopping altogether, moving on to acquiring a new supervisor for a new area of expertise. So there are some negative ends, if you like, to this research journey where students leave. They might not be negative because the students have learned a lot along the way, but they might well feel as though they're failing. And it's important to enable them to feel they can leave when they need to, or that they can change supervisors if another supervisor's expertise is more appropriate. Finding out about the regulations, not giving up too quickly, enabling the student to see that this is normal, but they can't do it all too regularly because they might well run out of supervisors available to supervise them. All of these kind of ways of understanding what the rules, regulations, and the human cost of interactions breaking down. There is a lot of material in the research that makes positive suggestions about handling this. But it is quite normal for students to maybe change their supervisor, and for you perhaps to decide also that another supervisor needs to be brought into the mix. So finding out the rules and learning how to work positively over time with students to make different and sometimes difficult decisions. That's what this section's about.